Her name was Della Coyle. She was 12 years old, and every evening that winter, she carried a tin pail down the marsh road to a blind old man the county paid her household to feed. Here is what they fed him. The Pruitts scraped the good meat off the top first, the lean off the ham, the white off the bird. Then they filled his pail with what was left. The fat, the gristle, the heel of the loaf gone hard at the end. That was his supper. That was what the county dollar bought. Della didn't cry over it. She just sat down on his cedar shaving floor, opened the county paper, and started reading, because nobody else would sit. From the farmhouse door, Cordy Pruitt used to call after her, "Don't waste your evening on that blind old fool and his whittled ducks. Feed him and come home." The whole of Quillback Neck called him a pauper, a name on the poor rolls. And yet more than 30 gunning rigs rode his ducks up and down that shore, and not one man among them ever spoke his name out loud. Then one evening Della read him the city page. An auction notice. A museum, she read, paying real money for working decoys, branded with 2 letters. F.D. His drawknife stopped, dead, halfway through a cut. She read the next line. And the story turns on what came after. But we'll cut here, just before she understood. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and stay with this channel, because we sit with the ones the world walked past. And do me one kindness. Comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far down the shore this story travels tonight. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The fever came the winter Della turned 11. It took her mother in January, and her father before the ground thawed. There was no one else. No aunt, no grandmother, no cousin with a spare bed. So the county did what the county did with children like her. They placed her out. Placed out. That was the word for it. It meant a farm took you in, and in return, you gave them your hands. Your keep for your labor. Nobody signed anything that made you theirs. You were a body that worked and a mouth that ate, and if the arrangement soured, they could send you back and take another. The Pruitts took her in the spring. Hollis Pruitt farmed rented ground and stayed one bad crop ahead of the bank. Cordy kept the house and kept the money, and there was never quite enough of either. Della learned fast. She learned to be small at the table. She learned to be first up and last down. She learned which chores the family hated most, because those were the ones that came to her. The chore they hated most was the blind man. His name was Ferris Dorman. He lived alone at the edge of the guts, where the marsh gave way to open water, in a shack that leaned like it was tired. The county paid the Pruitts a stipend to feed him. Cordy collected the money and passed the trouble down the line, and the line ended at Della. The first night, she was afraid of him. She'll tell you that plainly. She walked the marsh road in the blue cold, with the pail knocking against her knee, and every step she rehearsed being brave. The shack didn't look like a place a person lived. It looked like a place wood came to be worked. She pushed the door, and the smell hit her first. Cut cedar. Sharp and clean and sweet, the way nothing else on that farm smelled. Shavings lay ankle-deep across the whole floor, pale curls of it banked in the corners like drift snow. There was a workbench under the one window. A tub of water sat beside it on the dirt, and on a long shelf against the far wall stood the ducks, rows of them, ranked like they were waiting for a whistle, canvasbacks with their heads low and easy, redheads, buffleheads no bigger than her fist. Some were bare wood. Some wore paint so soft and dead grass dull, you'd have sworn they'd swum in off the gut and sat down to dry. The old man was at the bench. He didn't turn. "You're the new one," he said. His voice came out like gravel poured slow. "Set it down by the stove. Then get on home before you're dark." She set the pail down. She meant to go. Her feet meant to go, but she looked at his hands instead. They were moving. A curl of wood peeled off under a long blade and dropped, and another, steady as breathing, and his eyes never once looked down at the work. They didn't look at anything. They were shut, or near it, turned to the middle of nothing. She should have gone home. Instead, she heard her own voice ask the things she'd wonder about the rest of her life. "Could I read to you while you whittle?" The blade stopped. "For just a second." "Read what?" he said. "The paper." She had it folded in her coat. She'd taken it from the Pruitt's kitchen to have something of her own on the long walk. "I've got today's," he grunted. That was all. Not a yes. But he didn't say no, and he didn't tell her to go, so she lowered herself down onto the sea of shavings, right there on his floor, and she opened the county paper to the first page and began to read. She read him the market page. The price of oysters at the packing house. Down again. The price of muskrat hides. Up a little. She read the drowning notices, because there were always drowning notices on that shore, in that season. A waterman off Tillman. A boy through the ice at Cook's Point. She read the auction column. Farms going under the hammer. A widow's furniture. A mortgaged mule. The whole time, the blade kept peeling. Curl after curl. And she understood, without either of them saying it, that she had found the one thing the whole cold county would let her do that didn't feel like being used. She was giving something, and he was letting her. She walked home in full dark and got a scolding for it, and she went back the next night anyway. By the end of that first week, she'd noticed the pail. She noticed because she carried it both ways. She saw what Cordy put in it, the fat cut off the family's meat, the ends, the parts you'd give a dog if you had a dog you didn't much care for. And she saw the old man eat it without a word of complaint, because a man on the poor rolls learns early that complaint costs more than it buys. So Della started saving him the crust off her own plate. She did it quiet. She'd wrap it in her handkerchief when Cordy's back was turned and tuck it in her coat, and at the shack she'd set it by his hand on the bench, still soft from her own supper. She never said what it was or why. That would have spoiled it. He never thanked her. Not once. That wasn't his way, and she came to understand it wasn't meanness either. What he did, the third or fourth time, was reach up to the shelf without looking, take down a little bufflehead drake finished bright and smooth, and put it in her hands. "Hold that," he said. "Don't drop it." She held it. It was lighter than she expected, and warmer than wood had a right to be, and the paint was worked so fine she could see each feather laid separate. She sat there holding a duck while he ate her crust, and neither of them said one word about kindness. That was the trade. She'd never in her life felt so squarely paid. She didn't know yet what she was holding. She thought it was a toy a blind man made to pass the dark. She had no idea she was holding $6 of another county's museum money warm in her two hands. It took her a while to learn how he worked. She learned by watching, night after night, from her spot on the floor. One evening he pulled a fresh block off the pile. "White pine," he told her when she asked, "because it floated high and cut sweet and didn't check on you in the sun." He set it in a clamp and took up the drawknife, the long blade with a handle at each end that he pulled toward himself in one clean draw. "This one's a canvasback," he said. "Body first, always the body." And then she watched a blind man carve a duck. He didn't fumble. That was the thing that stopped her breath a little. His thumb went down the block ahead of the blade, reading it, feeling the grain run, finding the places the wood wanted to split and the places it would hold. He turned the block by feel and drew the knife, and a long curl came away, and under it was the beginning of a back, a breast, the low, proud swell of a duck at rest. "You set the shape with your hands," he said, not really to her, just out loud the way a man talks when he's alone and has forgotten he isn't. "Eyes lie to you anyhow. Eyes'll tell you it looks right sitting on a bench. Bench don't matter. Water matters." When the body was rough close, he did the thing she never forgot. He carried it to the tub by the bench and set it on the water. It floated. And he crouched down and put 2 fingers on it, light as a moth, and pressed here and there, watching with his hands how it rode. It leaned. He grunted, took it back to the bench, shaved a hair off the bottom, hollowed the underside a touch, and floated it again. Ballast, he said. A bird's got to ride right in a chop. Duck out on the gut in a blow. If your decoy sits high and dead, the live ones know. They know from the air. Won't come down to a lie. He pressed it again, and this time it sat, breast up, tail easy, the way a real one sits when it's fed and calm and fears nothing. There, that one'll pull birds in a north wind. Della looked up from the floor, past his shoulder, to the top shelf. The high one. There was a bird up there set apart from all the rest. A canvasback. Older looking than the others, the paint gone soft with handling. It stood alone, and in all the weeks she came, she never once saw him take it down to sell. "What's that one?" she asked. "The high one you keep." His hands went still a half-second. Then went on. "That one's not for selling," he said. And that was all. She'd have to wait to learn that if you turn that duck over, keel up to the light, there were 2 letters burned deep into the wood. F.D. She didn't know that yet. But she'd filed the bird away in the careful place where she kept things, the same as she filed everything, because a placed-out child learns to keep an inventory of the world. It's the only property she's got. The notices in the city page changed that spring. She read him one on a raw night in March. A dealer, it said, a man from the city, was in the tidewater country asking after old shore rigs, old working decoys. He'd pay, the notice said, for the right ones. Ferris didn't answer that, but something in the shack answered for him. Because 2 evenings later, a young fellow came to the door and let himself in like he'd done it 100 times. Tolly Vane, he said his name was, when Della asked. He was maybe 19, with paint dried in the creases of his knuckles. He didn't come to talk. He came to work. He pulled a stool to the bench, laid out little pots of paint, took up a brush, and set a bare canvasback drake in front of himself. And then Ferris Dorman, who could not see the brush or the paint or the bird, told him how to paint it. "Dead grass on the sides first," Ferris said. "Thin, don't glob it. Let the wood come through underneath. That's what gives it life in low light." Tolly laid it on. Now the back. Canvasback drake's back isn't white, it's 100 little lines, gray on white, fine as a fingerprint. Vermiculation, the city man calls it. I call it the reason a live drake trusts him. He tipped his head, listening to the brush drag. "Finer than that. You're plowing. Tickle it." Della sat on the floor and watched the whole thing, and something turned over slow in her chest. The young man had the eyes. The young man held the brush, but every line that brush laid down came out of the blind man's mouth. The bird was Tolly's hand and Ferris's seeing, and the seeing was the part that mattered, because a boy with 2 good eyes was taking his orders from a man with none. She didn't say it, but she had it now, filed away with the high shelf and the 2 letters she hadn't seen yet. Something here was upside down from how the county told it. The gunners proved it, in their way, all through the spring. They came at odd hours for their birds. Watermen, mostly. Hard men with salt in their coats, and they'd stamp the marsh mud off at the door and pay for a rig of decoys and whatever they had. Coin, when they had coin. More often eggs, or a sack of oysters, or a jug, or a day's work owed. They'd load the ducks careful, wrapped in feed sacks, like the ducks were the valuable thing, and the money was the cheap thing. And Della, sitting quiet with her paper, listened to how they spoke of him. Never his name. Never Ferris. Never Mr. Dorman. It was always the Dorman rig. As in, I run the Dorman rig, best gunner on the neck runs the Dorman rig, you won't kill a canvasback over store-bought blocks when the man beside you is floating Dormans. His name had come loose from the man and stuck to the ducks. The ducks had a reputation up and down that's sure that the man himself was not allowed to have, because the man himself was a pauper on the poor rolls. And the county had already decided what a pauper was worth. Della filed that away too. The pile of things she wasn't saying was getting tall. Then, on a gray afternoon in early April, the county came to the shack, and Della saw for the first time exactly how low the world had set him. She was there because it was a Saturday, and she'd walked over early. Cordy came too, which Cordy never did. But the poor overseer had sent word. And the stipend was Cordy's money, so Cordy came to protect it. Two neighbor women came along behind her for the show of it. And the overseer himself, a square man named in a ledger somewhere as the guardian of the county's charity, walked into the shack with a pencil and a printed form to take the annual inventory of the poor rolls. He didn't take his hat off. He looked around the shack the way you'd look at a stall that needed mucking. Shavings all over, he said, and made a mark. Fire hazard. Old man, you'll burn yourself up in here one night. Ferris sat at his bench and said nothing. The overseer walked the length of the shelf. All those ducks, rows and rows of the finest working decoys on the tidewater, birds that watermen paid and owed labor to own. Birds that rode a chop like they were alive. He went down the line and towed one with his boot, tipped it, let it rock back. Whittling, he said. Kindling, more like. Man's got to keep his hands busy, I suppose. He made another mark. He priced the whole shack out loud, the leaning walls and the stove and the tools and every duck on every shelf. And the number he said was so small Della felt it in her stomach. Near nothing. He wrote the near nothing down. Then he turned around at the door and delivered the thing he'd really come to say. A blind man living alone out here. He shook his head. Reasonable. Almost kind. Which was the worst of it. It won't do come next winter. One bad spell, and we'll have to move you into the county home. For your own good. You understand. Can't have the parish answering for a blind man froze in a marsh. The county home. Della knew what that was. Everybody's child knew what that was. It was the place they took the old and the broke and the used up, and you did not come back out of it, and you had no door of your own inside it, and every hour of your day belonged to somebody with a ledger. Ferris Dorman said not one word. But Della, watching from her spot on the floor, saw his jaw go tight and set, saw the drawknife stop in his hand and stay stopped, saw a man decide to be silent in a way that cost him more than shouting ever would. The neighbor women murmured. Cordy looked satisfied. A threat to move him was no threat to her money as long as he stayed feedable through winter. They all filed out into the gray, pleased with a chore done. And the ducks sat on the shelf, and the high one sat above them all. And nobody in that room had looked at any of it and seen a single thing. After that day, Della was afraid for him, and being afraid, she read harder. She'd been reading him the whole paper all along, the market page, the drownings, the little auctions. But now she went further into the city page than she used to, into the columns from the museums and the collectors and the city money. Because somewhere in her 12-year-old head was the sense that answers to a threat like the county home came from far off, from the wide world, not from any place on the neck. And on a night late, in April, she found it. The whole notice. Not the little dealer's line from the winter, the full thing, run large. She read it out slow, the way she read words she didn't know the weight of. A state museum, it said, and a private folk collection in the city, both, were seeking to purchase working decoys. Genuine gunning birds, it said, from the vanishing tidewater shore. And they were paying, the notice said, real money. More money than Della had words for birds branded with 2 letters. For the work of a shore hand the notice called vanished, a maker gone off the record, whose early birds the collections already held and prized. Branded F, Della read. F, D, across the shack. At the bench, Ferris Dorman's hands went still. It was the second time she'd seen it happen. The drawknife stopped mid-draw, the curl half lifted, and did not finish. His whole body went to listening. And this time she understood there was a reason, even if she didn't yet let herself understand the reason. Slow, without meaning to, Della's eyes went up to the top shelf, to the high canvasback he kept and never sold, the one whose keel she'd never seen. She looked at that bird a long time. She did not say it. She was a child who had learned to keep an inventory in silence, and she kept this too. She closed her mouth over it and folded the paper and read him the next notice down. A mule sale, in a voice that shook only a little, and Ferris carved on after a minute like nothing had passed between them. But something had. They both knew a thing now, and neither one would be the one to say it. She stopped asking him for anything after that. She'd never asked for much. Now she asked for nothing at all. Instead, she started giving him a thing she'd never thought to give, because she'd spent her whole placed-out life believing she had only two things to offer anybody: a pair of working hands and a little pity. She'd never once counted her eyes as worth anything to a blind man. What would he want with her eyes? But she began, unbidden, to describe the world to him. She'd come in from the marsh road and, before she even sat, she'd tell him what she'd walked through. Wind's off the gut tonight, hard, out of the northwest. Whitecaps clear across. The tide's way out, the flats are showing, and there's a heron standing on one leg and the guts not moving at all. He didn't ask her to. He never said do that. But he stopped carving to listen when she did it, and after a while she saw that he was carving better for it. Because a man carving a duck to swim in weather he can't see is helped, is fed, by somebody telling him what the weather's doing. She'd tell him the color of the very block under his hands. That drake you're cutting, the wood's near white where you shaved it, but there's a streak of red-brown running through the breast, right where you're working now. And his thumb would go to the streak, and he'd nod and set his cut to run with it instead of against. She was putting her eyes at his service. Nobody told her to. She just stopped believing pity was all she had and started spending the one thing she'd never valued. And it turned out to be the very thing he'd been short of his whole blind life. The night she truly understood him, he made a redhead. Start to finish, by feel, while she narrated the light. It was near dusk when he began, and full dark by the stove when he finished, and the whole way through she told him what she saw. She told him the sun going down red over the far shore. She told him the exact shade of the wood as the lamp came up gold on it. She told him the water in the tub had gone black and still, and his hands made a duck in the dark, the body drawn and floated and ballasted, the head set on true. And when it was done, he handed it to her to carry to the tub, and she set it on the black water, and it sat, breast up, tail easy, fearless, perfect, a live redhead drake at rest that a blind man had made in a dark room from a girl's description of the light. Della crouched by the tub and looked at that duck floating there, and she understood, finally and completely, exactly what she was 6 inches away from. Not a poor blind old fool who whittled to pass the dark, not kindling, not a pauper. She was 6 inches from a master, a maker whose birds were already behind glass in cities she'd never see, and the whole county had been feeding him fat off their plates for $1 and calling it charity. She understood the whole of it now, and she still said nothing. But understanding is a kind of pressure, and pressure has to move somewhere. It moved a week later, on an evening when Tolly Vane was there laying paint. Ferris had cut a fresh canvasback drake, and Tolly had it on the bench, brush in hand, and Ferris was giving the directions the way he always did. Dead grass on the sides. Thin, no. Thinner than that, you're globbing again. And Tolly, tired or careless, laid it on too heavy, and Ferris heard the drag of it and clicked his tongue. And Della, before she'd decided to, got up off the floor. She crossed the shack. She stood at Tolly's shoulder, and she reached out and, gentle, took the brush right out of the young man's hand. Tolly let it go. Surprised, Ferris turned his head at the change in the room. The way he turned at any change. "Who's got the brush?" he said. "I do," said Della. She sat herself down on the stool at the bench. She dipped the brush and wiped it near dry against the pot, the way she'd watched Tolly do a dozen times. She set the tip to the drake's side. And she said, "Steady. Tell me. I'll lay it exactly where you say. I can see it. Tell me, and I'll be your eyes." The shack went quiet. The stove ticked. Tolly stood back with his empty hand and didn't argue, and something in his face said he'd known this was coming before Della did. Ferris Dorman didn't speak for a long moment. His blind face was turned toward the girl at his bench, and whatever was moving behind it, she couldn't read. Then his rough voice came, low, and it did not say no. "Dead grass," he said. "On the sides. Thin." And Della Coyle laid down her first stroke of paint to the blind man's word, the two of them one seeing thing at last, his hands and her eyes finishing a bird together in the lamplight, with no idea at all that down the dark marsh road, at that very hour, a motor car from the city had turned off the county pike and was coming slow along the guts, its headlamps swinging across the reeds, its driver stopping at every house to ask the same question. Who cut the FD, birds, and where do I find the man? The motor car stopped at the Pruitt gate a little after 8. Della was still in the shack then. She didn't know. She was laying dead grass down the Drake's flank, thin the way Ferris told her, and the lamp was low, and the stove ticked. And for that 1 hour, the whole world was 6 inches wide and smelled of cedar and turpentine. Up at the farmhouse, Cordy Pruitt opened her door to a stranger in a good coat. "Evening," the man said. He had a soft city voice. He held his hat. "I'm looking for the man who cut the shore rigs branded FD. I was told to ask along this road." Cordy looked at his coat. She looked at the black shape of the automobile behind him, cooling in the dark. "FD," she said. 2 letters, burned in the keel. "Working birds, gunning birds. There's people would pay to know the maker." "Pay," Cordy said. "Yes, ma'am." And Cordy Pruitt, who had looked at Ferris Dorman 1,000 times and never once seen a maker, felt something turn over, slow in her chest. She did not say the blind man's name. Not yet. She was not a fool. She said the stranger should come back in daylight, and she watched his tail lamps go back up the guts. And then she stood a long while in her doorway, with the money word going round in her head. Pay. Real money. For the ducks the county paid her to feed him over. Della came up the dark road an hour later, with the empty pail. Cordy was still at the window. She watched the girl come, and her face had a new thing in it, and Della felt it before she understood it, the way you feel weather change. The city man came asking after Ferris the next evening. Della got to the shack first and told him. "There's a man from the city," she said, breathless from the road, in a motor car. "He was up at the Pruitts. He's asking who cut the FD birds." Ferris was at the bench. His hands stopped. They had been going. The whole while she spoke, the drawknife riding a fresh pine body, curling up shavings soft as ribbon. And they stopped. And the shack went so quiet, she could hear the tub of water settle against its own sides. "He can ask," Ferris said. "You don't answer for me. You hear? Not one word, but he's got money." "He said," "I heard what he said." "You didn't." Ferris set the drawknife down. He turned his blind face toward her, and his voice went low and hard and old. "Girl, listen to me now. A poor man that nobody wants is left alone. That's the one thing he's got. The minute they find out he's worth something, he stops being left alone. He gets managed. They come with papers and reasons, and it's all for his own good. And at the end of it, there's a bed in the county home and a man in it who used to have a bench. That's not. That is exactly what that is." He felt for the drawknife again, found it, held it, and didn't cut. "I've watched it happen to better men than me. You keep your mouth shut, and you let that motor car go on down the road empty. Promise me." Della looked at him. She looked at the tub, and the shavings ankle deep on the floor, and the one canvas back up on the high shelf that he never sold, alone up there, keel out. And she saw the cage. She saw that he'd built it himself, and locked it himself, and called it freedom, because it was the only door nobody else could open. "I promise," she said. She meant it when she said it. She was 12. She didn't yet know what promises cost. The city man's name was Roland Sewell, and he found his own way in the end. He didn't need Della. He needed a boaster. It was Tolly Vane. Not from meanness. Tolly never had a mean bone. He was proud, was all. Sewell caught him at the landing where the gunners tied up and asked his open question. And Tolly, young and glad to be asked, said sure. He knew whose birds those were. He laid paint to them himself. He talked the way a young man talks when a man in a good coat treats him like he matters. So on a gray afternoon in early April, the motorcar came down the last of the guts and stopped where the road quit, and Roland Sewell walked the plank path to the shack of the blind man in the marsh. Della was there. Of course she was there. She was always there now. Sewell knocked on the doorframe, polite, and stepped in, and stopped. She watched his eyes go around the room. The shavings, the tub, the drawknife, the birds ranked on the low shelves, and the one high up, alone, Mr. Dorman, Sewell said. I don't want anything, Ferris said from the bench. He didn't turn. I'm not selling. I'm buying. Sewell took his hat off. He was not a young man himself, and there was something careful in him, something that had learned to move slow around things that mattered. My name's Roland Sewell. I buy old shore rigs for collections. And I've come a long way, sir, because some of your birds are already where I work. My birds are on the water, Ferris said, where they belong. Some of them are behind glass. The drawknife stopped again. Sewell reached into a flat leather case he carried, and he drew out 2 stiff cards, and he held them so the light off the tub caught them. Della came close to look. They were photograph plates, printed clean and gray, and each one showed a duck. A canvasback, sitting easy, and under each, small letters printed, and a case number, and words she read without meaning to. This one, Sewell said, and tapped the first, sits in a state museum, 300 miles north. Come in 11 years ago with an old gunning collection, no maker named. This one, he tapped the second, is in a city folk collection. Same story. Anonymous shorthand, they wrote. Nobody knew the man. But it's the same hand. Anybody with an eye can see it's the same hand. He lowered the cards. 2 museums, Mr. Dorman. Your birds have been in 2 museums for 11 years, and nobody knew your name to put on them. The shack was silent. Della stood there with the photograph plates a foot from her face, and she looked from the printed duck to the high shelf, to the sleeper canvasback that Ferris kept and never sold, and it was the same bird. Not the same one. The same maker. The same tuck of the head, the same easy ride. She had seen it every single evening for months and thought it was only a duck. She did not know. And then she knew the size of it. 2 museums, she said. Out loud, small. 2, said Sewell. And there's a winter show. And the people who run it would like, more than near anything, to stop writing anonymous under the finest working canvasbacks anybody's seen come off this shore. He turned to Ferris. They'd like the maker, alive, by name, on the label. Ferris Dorman sat with his blind face down at his own still hands, and what he said was, "You should go now." Della didn't understand it then. She understood it later. He wasn't refusing the honor. He was refusing the door. Because he told her already, the minute they know you're worth something, you stop being left alone. But it was already too late for that. Cordy Pruitt had heard the money word 2 nights before, and the money word travels. It travelled fast. Within a week, Cordy had been to the county seat. She was not stupid, Cordy. She put it together, plain and hard, the way she put everything. The blind man lived on her premises. She drew the county stipend to keep him. He ate off her charge, on her ground, on the county's dime. So the ducks he made on her ground, the ducks a city man would pay real money for. Those, she reasoned, were the household's, hers, to sell. And the overseer, when she brought it to him, did not much disagree. He came out to the shack himself, the county poor overseer, the same man who'd towed the shelf, and called the birds kindling back in the fall. He came with Cordy, and with his poor rolls book under his arm, and he stood in the door of the shack, and he read out what he'd come to read. "Ferris Dorman," he said, "you're a blind man living alone at the edge of the county, and it's the county's judgment you can't keep yourself through another winter. You'll be moved to the county home before the cold. Your place here reverts. The contents, he waved his hand at the shelves, at a life's work, are held against your keep. They're not the county's, Della said. She couldn't help it. They're his. He made every one. The overseer looked at her the way men look at a child who's spoken. And who are you? I read to him. I paint his birds. I'm his. She stopped. She didn't have the word. She was a placed-out girl. She had no claim to anything. Not to a bed, not to a name, not to the man at the bench. She held nothing anybody in that doorway would recognize. You're the Pruitt's charge, the overseer said, same as he's the county's. Neither one of you owns the ground you stand on. He folded his book. It's decided. And Sewell, who was still in the county then, still trying, came to Della white around the mouth with a worse thing yet. The catalog closes in 40 days, he said. The winter show. If I can't put a documented living maker to those birds inside 40 days, a name, proof, a record that stands, they go in the case the way they've sat 11 years. Anonymous, shore folk art, maker unknown. Forever, Della. Once it's printed, it doesn't get unprinted. He'll have made the finest rig on the shore and died a nameless pauper in the county home, and I can't stop it alone. I'm a stranger with 2 photographs. I need something that stands. 40 days. A placed-out girl with no claim, and a blind man about to be carried off to the county home in 40 days. That was the bottom of it. That was the all is lost. Della went home to the Pruitt farm that night, and she did not sleep. She lay in the cold little room off the kitchen, and she thought about the man at the bench and the 2 museums and the word anonymous, and somewhere in the black middle of the night, she remembered the thing she'd been doing all along, without knowing it was a weapon. She'd been keeping a book. Not on purpose, not for this. All those evenings, while Ferris carved and talked, she'd been writing things down in the back of the county paper, and then in a little copybook, because she liked to. Every bird he finished, what he called it, what he told her to lay on it. Dead grass on the sides, thin, vermiculation gray, close, off the drake's back. She'd written his directions in her own reading hand, night after night, because they were the only lessons anybody had ever bothered to give her. She had 100 pages of The Blind Man's Eye, set down in a girl's careful print. And she had one more thing. She had the sleeper. She went to the shack before light. She took the high canvas back down off the shelf, the one he kept, the one he never sold, and she turned it over in her 2 hands, and there in the keel, burned deep and plain, were the 2 letters. FD. She carried the copybook and the branded bird to Roland Sewell, and she set them both down in front of him, and she said, "Here. It's all here. Every bird. What he called it, how he made it, in my own hand, and dated. And this one's got the brand." She turned it keel up. "Is it enough? Does it stand?" Sewell opened the copybook. He turned the pages slow. He read a girl's careful writing of a blind man's spoken eye, months of it, dated and plain, and his hand was not quite steady. Then he set the branded canvas back down on his own table, next to the museum plate, keel to keel, glass duck to shack duck. And he looked at the 2 of them together a long time, and didn't say anything at all. When he did speak, his voice had gone rough. "It stands," he said. "God help them all. It stands." They gathered in the shack. Sewell made it so. He wanted it there, on the ground, in front of the same people who'd stood in that door and called a life's work kindling. Cordy and Hollis behind her. And the overseer, with his book. And 2 neighbors who'd come to see. And Tolly Vane in the corner with paint still in his knuckles. And Della beside the bench where she always was. And Ferris in his chair with his blind face turned toward the door. Sewell set the museum plate down on the workbench, and beside it he stood the sleeper canvas back, keel out, the 2 letters plain. "I want everybody in this room to look at these 2 ducks," he said. "This one's in a museum 300 miles from here. This one came off that shelf this week. Look at them. Go on. Look, and they looked. The neighbors leaned in, and even Cordy, who did not want to, looked and saw the same duck twice, the museum duck and the shack duck, the same head, the same ride, the same hand, and something moved in her face that she couldn't put back. Sewell let them look their fill. Then he turned to Cordy Pruitt, and he said the thing quiet, which was worse than loud. "You've been feeding the finest decoy hand on this shore the fat off your plates for a county dollar," he said. "You sent him the gristle and the heel of the loaf, and you stood in that door and called his life's work kindling. Ma'am, there are men in cities who would give a year's wages to have sat where this girl sat every evening, and you paid her to hate the chore." Cordy's mouth opened. There was nothing in it. Everything she had ever had to say to Ferris Dorman had been said from that doorway, loud, and now the doorway was full of people, and she had nothing. "I only ever fed him," she said. Nobody answered her. Sewell had already turned away. He went at it layer by layer, and he gave each thing its own room, and he never once raised his voice. Because he didn't need to. He named the gunners, 30 rigs up and down the shore, riding this man's birds, he said, and not one of you ever said his whole name, only the Dorman rig, like the ducks made themselves. He held up the 2 museum plates and named the collections, and read out the case numbers, and said 11 years twice, so it landed. He laid his hand on Della's copybook and told them what it was, a documented record, dated in a witness's hand, of a living maker's own working method, and he said the word that changed everything. "The Index of American Design," he said, "keeps a national record of this exact kind of work. I've sent for their recorder. He's coming down this road inside the week to enter Ferris Dorman into the record of the United States. Alive, by name, as the maker." He looked at the overseer, not as a pauper, as an artist. The country's going to have him written down right, and it's going to have him written down before winter. The overseer stood there with his poor rolls book under his arm and his face gone the color of the ashes in the stove. And Cordy's claim came apart in front of her, quiet, the way a bank gives way, because a maker who's documented owns the one thing that matters, which is the maker's name. And everything that name is worth flows to the name and not to the ground it stood on. The household had fed him scraps. The household, Sewell said plain, owned the scraps it had served. It did not own the man, and it did not own his hands, and it did not own what his hands had made. Through all of it, Ferris Dorman sat at his bench and said nothing. He didn't gloat. There was no meanness in him. There never had been. He didn't turn his blind face toward Cordy once, or toward the overseer, to see them brought low, because he couldn't see them and wouldn't have wanted to. When Sewell was done, Ferris spoke, and all he said was the one thing. "Enter the birds right," he said. "That's all I ask. Get the names of them right on the labels. A canvasback's a canvasback, and a redhead's a redhead, and I won't have them wrong in a case forever." And then, quieter, to Sewell, "Thank you for coming down the road." And he reached out, blind, and found Della's arm, and held it. The recorder came, and he entered Ferris Dorman into the Index of American Design. Alive, by name, the maker of the rig. He wrote down the birds, and their right names, and their dates, all of it out of Della's copybook. And when he got near the end, he asked, the way they always ask, who kept the record? Whose hand was this? And Ferris, before Della could speak, said it for her. "Set her down too," he said. "The girl. She read me the notices and she kept the book, and she gave me her eyes when mine were 40 years gone. Set it down that the birds were made by Ferris Dorman, and set down by Della Coyle. Both names. Or don't set down either." So they wrote both. And that was the thing that saved her. Though nobody planned it that way. Because a placed-out girl with no claim to anything was one thing, and the named apprentice and recorder of a documented American master was another. And the second one had a place in the world the first one never had. The guardianship question that had hung over both of them came down to the county office one more time, and the overseer sat at his desk with his poor rolls page in front of him. And he had to strike a line. He struck it. Pauper, no trade. It had said beside Ferris Dorman's name for years. He crossed it out, and in the space he wrote the word the whole neck had never once used, which was maker, and beside it he wrote that the man was under no order to be moved, and the threat of the county home died right there where it had been signed. He didn't like it. He folded the page after and said the only thing he had left, which was, "It says pauper right here," tapping the old crossed out line, as if the crossing out were somebody else's doing and not his own hand. The label answered him, not anybody's mouth. The label. They took the sleeper canvas back to the museum in the fall, the one Ferris had kept all those years and never sold. The one with F.D. burned in the keel. It went behind glass, in the winter show, in the city, 300 miles up from the guts where it was made. Della went up on the train to see it. She'd never been on a train. She stood in the museum vestibule in a coat that was still too big for her. And she found the case, and there it was, the sleeper, riding easy on a bed of dark cloth, like it was riding a chop. The same duck she'd held in her two hands in the lamplight 100 times. And under it a small white card. It said the bird was a working canvasback decoy. It said where it was made and when. It said the maker was Ferris Dorman, of the Tidewater shore. And under his name, smaller, it said, recorded by Della Coyle. A girl's name beneath a man's, in a museum, in a city, forever. She stood there a long time and did not cry, the same way she hadn't cried over the scraps in the pail the first night. She just looked. Because looking, it turned out, was the thing she'd always had to give, and never known it was worth anything. And it was worth this. A year on, the shack was still the shack. That was the thing about it. The money changed a few things, and not the main thing. Ferris wouldn't leave the marsh, and Della wouldn't have made him. There was cedar shavings ankle deep on the floor still, and the tub of water still stood by the bench, and the drawknife still went shush, shush, curling up ribbon off a fresh pine body, and the whole place still smelled like cut cedar, and turpentine, and stove smoke. Ferris sat at the bench. He was older by a winter, and no different in the hands. Della sat at his elbow, taller by a winter, with the county paper open on her knee, reading him the market page aloud out of long habit. Except the notices were all about him now. Museums asking. Collectors asking. A dealer up north wanting to know, would the maker consider. She read them out, and he grunted at them the same way he'd grunted at the drowning notices the first night, like they were weather, like they had nothing to do with the bird in his hands. That February, there was a chop on the gut, a real one, wind out of the northwest, laying the reeds flat. And out on the water rode a canvasback he'd finished the week before. A working bird, a gunning bird, and it sat that chop the way he'd built it to sit, riding right, breast down, easy. Not a bird on the water fished better. He couldn't see it. He never could. But Della watched it from the bank and told him. And he nodded, because he'd known before she said it. He'd known it in his thumb. She'd carried his supper down that road the first night, thinking she was the charity, thinking she had nothing to give a poor blind man but pity and the heel of a loaf. And the whole time, the man in the marsh shack had been in 2 museums, and the only thing on this earth he'd ever lacked was somebody who would sit down on his floor and look. She was the one who looked. That was all it ever took. Tell me the town you're watching from tonight, and I'll tell you how far down the shore this story's traveled. The sleeper canvasback was gone from the shelf. It had been gone since October, when the man from the museum came a second time with the paperwork already drawn, and Ferris had handed it over without ceremony. Lifting it down with both hands and setting it in the man's arms, the way you'd hand off an infant you trusted the person to carry right. He did not say goodbye to it. He'd already made another one. The same hand, the same keel, the same FD burned careful into the wood. Because a man doesn't stop being who he is, just because somebody finally noticed. The vestibule of the folk collection on the 3rd floor was not a large room. Glass case, 6 feet of dark walnut, a card typed clean on good stock. The birds inside were his early rigs, the ones the collection had owned for 11 years without knowing whose hands cut them. Now they knew. The card said so in plain letters. Ferris Dorman, Quillback Neck, Maryland, working decoy carver, B. Circa 1867. Chesapeake canvasback, mallard, bufflehead, carved by feel from memory of a market gunner's eye. And beneath that, smaller, the way a footnote carries what matters most when the main text isn't large enough, recorded and assisted by Della Coyle, Quillback Neck, Maryland, apprentice. She had not expected to see her name. She'd gone with Sewell to the city, only to be sure they spelled Ferris's right. She stood at the glass a long time. A school group came through, and a teacher read the card aloud to the children and said the maker was still living and still working. And one of the children asked where, and the teacher said a marsh in Maryland. And the child said, "What's a marsh?" And the teacher said a kind of wet meadow by the water, and Della did not say anything. She just stood there with her coat on and her hands in her pockets and looked at the birds behind the glass. Birds she had helped paint. Birds she had described back to their maker by the color of the afternoon light off the gut, and thought about the first night she'd sat down on his floor with the county paper, thinking she was doing the charity. The drawknife still went shush in the shack on the neck. Cedar ribbons still curled off the blade and drifted to the floor. She'd be back by Thursday. He'd have a roughed-out mallard waiting, and she'd sit at his elbow and read him whatever had come in on the market page, and he'd grunt at it, and they'd get to work.